knocks on the window at 4 a.m.
A knock on the bedroom window shattered the silence of the night, yanking me out of the warm embrace of sleep. Did I imagine it? I wondered groggily, sitting up in bed and fumbling for my slippers. Another knock on the glass. No, it wasn't a dream. From the direction of the window came the faint sound of glass vibrating, as if someone was lightly tapping on it. In the quiet of the night, my racing heartbeat betrayed my location. I approached the window cautiously, listening closely. I couldn't hear a thing. Strange. With a trembling hand, I pulled back the curtain. Beyond it, there was nothing but dirty windows and a withering cactus. And outside the window, nothing as well. Yet, as I stood there, peering into the darkness for several minutes, I could clearly feel a faint vibration. Where was it coming from? No idea. Yawning, I threw on my robe and shuffled to the kitchen. Lighting a cigarette, I fully woke up. What was I even surprised about? The windows were old, after all. The frames were rotting in places. I still hadn't gotten proper double-glazed windows. That's why there were vibrations, caused by the strong wind. Our area was remote, on the outskirts of a small town, so there wasn't much to slow the wind down except for our dormitory. It must have been the same thing again. It wasn't the first time I'd seen this happen. I reassured myself with this explanation, taking a drag of bitter smoke. Yes, not the first time, but something felt different that night. I still wasn't convinced it was the usual sound. Maybe I really did hear knocking? Whatever. The thought of the upcoming workday overpowered my anxiety. After all, it was nearly 4 a.m. and I needed at least a little more sleep. The next day, I didn't think about the incident and felt I had given it a perfectly reasonable explanation. Why dwell on it? I focused on my studies instead. Another ordinary day passed, and around 9 p.m. I found myself walking along the empty streets lined with tall trees. Further ahead was a cemetery with its creepy gates that always creaked in the wind, the same wind that kept me up at night. It always unsettled me that my dormitory was just a couple of minutes' walk from that cemetery, and that I had to pass by it to get home, especially at night when it was dark and there wasn't a soul around. The atmosphere was eerie, to say the least. It wasn't so bad during the day, but in the evening it made my insides tighten. The dormitory where I lived, a 6-story building, seemed especially depressing to me. Its appearance, location, and residence all contributed to this impression. Sometimes I even thought my neighbors, given the chance, would gladly kill each other. With the cemetery nearby, it was no surprise that the people living here weren't exactly ordinary. Most of them seriously believed in ghosts or even stranger nonsense, and that's not even mentioning the Satanists on the 6th floor. Thankfully, I lived on the 4th and didn't have to pass by their floor to get home. The only person I could talk to, even briefly, was Mr. Luther from the 5th floor, a veteran who unfortunately lost a leg in the war. He now lived off a meager pension in this dump. Aside from him, I hadn't gotten to know any of my neighbors during the year I'd lived in this 6-story building. As usual, I was coming home late from university, and as always, Mr. Luther was there to greet me, sitting in his wheelchair, smoking an unfiltered cigarette. "Good evening, Jesse," Mr. Luther greeted me in his usual manner. "Good evening, Mr. Luther. How are you?" "Been better. Just out here for a smoke," he rasped. "Can't you smoke at home?" "I'm cooped up there all day. Gotta get some fresh air, you know," he replied, patting the wheel of his wheelchair. "And you, just back from university?" "Yeah, Mr. Luther. I'm so tired I can barely stand. I'd love to stay and chat, but I'm about to collapse," I mumbled, eager to get off the street and crash in bed. On my way inside, I passed a neighbor from the 1st floor. She looked to be about 25, if I wasn't mistaken. Every time I came home late from university, we crossed paths at the dorm entrance. Only recently had it dawned on me why she went out so late at night. Judging by her bright pink miniskirt, fishnet tights, and black leather crop top, It wasn't hard to guess why she needed to be out at such an hour. Still, I felt sorry for her. Maybe she didn't have a better choice. I politely said hello and rushed up the stairs without waiting for a reply. Opening the door to my apartment, I stepped inside. That evening, all I wanted was to shower and go to bed. And so I did. The apartment was quickly engulfed in darkness. I wrapped myself in a blanket and closed my eyes. But just as I began to drift off, suddenly, once again, the tapping on the glass pierced through my ears, gentle knocks accompanied by a faint vibration. I opened my eyes and listened carefully. What on earth was that? This time, I couldn't blame it on the strong wind. I could clearly hear knocks on the window, as if someone was rapping their knuckles against the glass. The vibration continued for about a minute before everything went quiet. I felt uneasy. I didn't even want to crawl out from under the blanket to check what it could be. Surely it was the same as last night. 2 dim streetlights, lonely trees, and that eerie cemetery shrouded in darkness. Everything was just as usual, I reassured myself. But I had definitely heard those knocks. There was no way I could have imagined it. I wasn't losing my mind, was I? Especially in the dead of night, when the only sound in the apartment was the ticking of the clock. It was impossible to mistake those knocks for anything else. On the other hand, I live on the 4th floor. Who in their right mind would climb to such a height and knock on some random window? Physically, it seemed impossible. The outer wall was smooth, with nothing to grab onto. I don't know. Tomorrow, I'll have to ask Mr. Luther about it. Maybe he heard something too. Eventually, my exhaustion overpowered my concern about the nocturnal tapping. I fell asleep that night, nothing else disturbed me. By morning, I had forgotten about the incident, as I had overslept for class. The only thought on my mind was how to avoid getting scolded by Mr. Walter White. Everything that had happened 2 nights in a row I chalked up to my fatigue. I convinced myself it was all just my imagination. That evening, as I was heading home, I didn't see Mr. Luther by the dorm entrance. While climbing the stairs, I debated whether or not to visit him and talk about the knocks. Or maybe it was just my imagination, and it wasn't worth the trouble. Still, my uneasiness told me I should stop by, so I did. After changing at home, I grabbed a couple of beers from the fridge and headed to his place. I knocked on his door. I heard the creak of his wheelchair, the click of the lock, and then his friendly face appeared. "Oh, good evening, Jesse." "Good evening, Mr. Luther. May I come in?" I asked, showing that I hadn't come empty-handed. "Do you even need to ask?" "Of course, run in," he laughed ironically, glancing at the scattered shoes. "Just excuse the mess. Are you just visiting, or is there something on your mind?" he asked suddenly. I decided to get straight to the point. "Well, here's the thing, Mr. Luther. For 2 nights in a row, I've been woken up by clear knocks on my window, followed by the glass rattling like it's about to crack." The old man frowned and opened a bottle of beer. "I wanted to ask if you'd heard anything like that. Maybe I'm just overworked from university, or maybe I'm going crazy. Or maybe I'm not the only one waking up to those sounds." Mr. Luther set his bottle aside and rolled closer to me, lowering his voice to a whisper. "So, you heard the knocking too, last night?" he continued, quiet whispering. At 4 a.m., rhythmic tapping, I stayed awake all night, waiting, his finger pointing toward an old rifle lying under his pillow. Clearly, by waiting, he meant he had been aiming at the dark window, ready for the worst. I nodded slowly, silently, not saying a word. Someone was climbing around the building, son. For an hour, I only saw a massive sledgehammer-like hand. I was waiting for a head to appear. He continued in a hushed tone, again gesturing toward the rifle. He was evidently prepared to shoot the creature and end the nightmare as soon as it showed its face. He stared at me with wide-open eyes, then rolled back and resumed drinking the beer he had set aside earlier. It was now clear why Mr. Luther looked so exhausted. I felt a strange mix of relief and horror, relief that I wasn't the only one hearing those knocks at night, and horror at the realization that this was no dream. It wasn't human. "Thank you, Mr. Luther," I whispered, my voice trembling. I made my way to the door without staying for a drink. "Wait," Mr. Luther stopped me. "Whatever you do, don't look out the window. Hide somewhere they can't find you," he whispered again, glancing toward the window. "And if anything happens, I'm just one floor above you," he added, nodding toward the rifle under his pillow. "Have a quiet night," I replied, shaking his hand firmly before leaving his apartment. "And you too. Have a quiet night, Jesse," Mr. Luther wished me as I left. I went back to my apartment and lit a cigarette while sitting in the kitchen. That night, I decided to sleep inside the closet. The darkness outside was already deep, and my exhaustion was starting to take over, making my eyes close involuntarily. I made a makeshift bed in the closet, closed the folding doors, and lay down to sleep. Whatever was happening outside the window, I was ready. Unfortunately, the night wasn't as quiet as Mr. Luther had wished. Around 3 in the morning, loud banging on the kitchen window woke me up. I almost screamed from the shock, risking revealing my hiding spot. After 5 seconds, the pounding stopped. My heart was racing and sweat poured down my face. It felt as if my conversation with the old man had somehow worsened the situation. The gentle tapping had turned into aggressive, forceful blows, followed by an eerie silence. I stayed inside the closet until dawn, unable to close my eyes again. Only when the first rays of sunlight peeked through the gap between the doors did I crawl out. After confirming there was no one outside the window, I exhaled in relief. Stepping into the kitchen, I froze in shock. On the window frame, there was a clear handprint. I didn't know what to compare it to, but on closer inspection, it looked as though someone with a dirty, soil-covered hand had left it there. The fear that gripped me at that moment is beyond words. My whole body started trembling uncontrollably. My hands shook as if I had Parkinson's. I tried taking a sedative, but it did little to help. I called the university to take the day off, claiming I was sick. With a trembling hand, I lit another cigarette. For several nights now, I'd been hearing knocks on my window, but who or what wanted my attention? Soon, my fear gave way to an intense determination to figure this out. My first plan was to visit Mr. Luther. After knocking on his door for 30 minutes with no response, I started to worry. I hoped the old man was okay. I tried to comfort myself, imagining that he was just in a deep sleep. Perhaps he had spent the night sitting by the window with his loaded rifle, keeping watch. After all, I hadn't heard any gunshots during the night. Since Mr. Luther wasn't answering, I decided to visit the neighbor on the first floor to see if she might know anything. To my surprise, when I got there, her door was wide open. Curiosity got the better of me, and I peeked inside. The apartment was in complete disarray, with clothes strewn everywhere and a shattered mirror on the dresser. I couldn't find her, but I did notice a similar handprint on her window. I decided to prepare for the upcoming night. I boarded up my windows and placed a kitchen knife in the closet where I planned to spend another sleepless night. Throughout the day, I hoped to see Mr. Luther, but his apartment remained eerily silent. Strange thoughts began to creep into my mind as the hours passed. I didn't really care about the neighbor from the first floor. I didn't even know her name, but I was genuinely worried about Mr. Luther. By around 6 in the evening, I tried calling him. The call was declined, so I decided to go up to his door again and knocked, identifying myself as Jesse. The door unlocked with a click, but instead of Mr. Luther's familiar, friendly face, I was met with the barrel of a shotgun aimed squarely at my forehead. I shifted my gaze from the gun to his weary face, which was marked by enormous dark circles under his eyes. He didn't trust me and looked as though he was expecting something from me. As his fingers slowly moved toward the trigger, I understood what he was waiting for. In a low whisper, I asked, "Did you stay up all night by the window again?" That seemed to satisfy him, and he lowered the shotgun from my forehead. "Come in, quickly," he urged me, gesturing for me to step inside his apartment. "Mr. Luther, I found a handprint on my window," I told him. "Quick, follow me and take a look," he hissed, gesturing for me to follow him into the bedroom. He pulled back the curtain, and I nearly collapsed onto the nearby couch in shock. There were multiple handprints on his window, just like the one on mine, but there was also a mark that looked like it had been left by a face. It was staring at me all night, damn it, he whispered angrily, his eyes fixed on the window. I knew it would show its face tonight, but I'm too old to stay awake for several nights in a row. I couldn't keep myself from falling asleep like an idiot. When I woke up, these marks were on the window. It must have been watching me the entire damn night. Now that thing knows I'm armed, he continued, still speaking in a hushed tone. "Jesse, I've realized one thing. It's become more aggressive," Mr. Luther whispered to me with a grim look. "Where did it come from? What godforsaken lab did it crawl out of?" Mr. Luther muttered under his breath. "I've got a friend who deals with surveillance cameras," I said hurriedly. "I'll try to borrow a couple from him, set them up properly. Maybe we can figure out where it comes from." Without waiting for a response, I headed toward the door. "Be careful. If you hear gunshots at night, just run. Calling the police is pointless. If something happens, we'll end up being blamed for it," Mr. Luther warned me as I left his apartment. After visiting Mr. Luther, I called that friend of mine. I managed to borrow one surveillance camera from him. By 9 in the evening, the camera was installed and linked to my phone. Earlier, around 7 in the evening, the police had come by regarding the disappearance of the neighbor from the first floor. They stayed for a while, questioning people. A crowd of curious onlookers gathered, most in house robes and slippers. After a couple of hours, the police left. The neighbors, with fear written all over their faces, returned to their apartments. Sadly, the police are powerless when it comes to cases reeking of outright paranormal activity. Midnight. I was already hiding in the closet, clinging to the hope that this was all just a long nightmare and I would wake up in my bed, drenched in sweat. Unfortunately, deafening knocks echoed through my apartment. My insides clenched as my heart pounded in sync with those knocks. My palms grew clammy as I reached for my phone. Then, in an instant, the boarded-up window in the living room shattered from a powerful blow. I grabbed my phone and started streaming the camera footage. "My God, what is that?" I muttered involuntarily before clasping my hand over my mouth. Rewinding the footage slightly, I could clearly see some humanoid creature crawling along the wall like an insect. Its face wasn't visible, but its movements alone were enough to make me nearly faint. It was unmistakably not human, people can't cling to vertical surfaces like that. And its size, it was at least 1.5, maybe 2 times larger than a person. I saw it smash the glass and enter my apartment. It was here, so close. Hiding in the closet, I could feel its presence, hear its footsteps crunching over broken glass. Its heavy, raspy breathing filled the apartment. The steps drew nearer and nearer. Finally, they stopped right in front of the closet. Dear God, I can't even begin to describe the sheer, primal fear that gripped me. My entire body was paralyzed. I couldn't even move the tips of my fingers. I tried not to breathe. It stopped right in front of the closet.
I know you're in there.
A terrible, raspy voice suddenly growled. It sounded as if it forced the words out, and they made me wet myself in terror. Then came the mocking, light taps on the closet door. It seemed to savor the moment, drawing it out. The only thought in my head was to quickly text Mr. Luther and pray he would read it immediately. Sitting in that closet, I thought of my parents. I felt like I would soon join them. Finally, the closet door creaked open. The first thing I saw was its hand, a grotesque appendage. I would even call it monstrous. Fingers of varying lengths intertwined with each other. A dark, filthy hand reached out as it opened the door. And then a deafening gunshot echoed outside. The lock on my front door exploded, nearly blowing the door off its hinges. Light from the hallway flooded into my apartment. The hideous creature recoiled and retreated toward the window. When the silhouette of Mr. Luther appeared in the doorway, shotgun in hand, the creature smashed yet another window and leapt out of the apartment. Shaking, sobbing, and with a conspicuous stain on my pants, I remained crouched in the closet, staring at the neighbor who had arrived just in time. It took several minutes for me to come to my senses. Mr. Luther revived me with cold water. The police weren't far behind. Naturally, they immediately apprehended the old man, putting him in the squad car. It's hard to blame them. Someone must have heard the gunshots and called them. When they arrived, they found the shattered lock on my door, and Mr. Luther, looking a bit like an unhinged war veteran clutching a shotgun. And then there was me, a terrified, sobbing wreck. It didn't look good. Fortunately, things worked out in the end. The next day, Mr. Luther was released, though his weapon was confiscated and he was fined. I spoke with the officers, intending to show them the footage from the surveillance camera, but I had forgotten to turn the camera off, so it had been recording the entire time, overriding the old footage with new material. However, the creature was nowhere to be seen in the recordings. The police laughed in my face, treating me like a fool, and suggested I get some rest to stop hallucinating. Ha! For 3 nights, I slept peacefully and started to recover from what had happened. But the creature reappeared. Not in Massachusetts, where I live, but in Nevada. I came across a Reddit discussion about a missing woman and her daughter. The post mentioned the same tapping on the window of the 7th floor and included photos of distinct dirty handprints on the glass. People mocked the post, calling it fake, but I know it's real. Smash that like button if you got scared, and leave a comment telling us which moment gave you chills. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel if you're not afraid. Choose one of the 2 videos on the screen to test your nerves. Boo!